Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. And yes, this is a Mormon Book Reviews episode, and I'm your host, Stephen Heidegger, by the way, because Rebecca, for the second time, is going to be on a Mormon Book Reviews episode as opposed to a Mormon Media Reviews episode. Rebecca, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. I'm just kind of bleeding over into all the things you do, right?
Yeah, well, it only makes sense. You have all these book clubs too, so of course you should be on Mormon Book Reviews more often as well. And speaking of books, folks, I just want to remind you that this month's book drawing is Battlefields to Temple Grounds: Latter-day Saints in Guam and Micronesia, edited by my good friend Devin Jensen, who's the one that gave me this copy. He's also a previous guest of mine. And so for those of you who are interested in getting a copy of this really cool book, and it's a series of papers about Micronesia and Guam and all this kind of stuff, where they have the history of the saints there, in the description, just check my email, mormonbookreviews.com. In the subject heading, say book contest, and then just give me your name and address. U.S. residents only. The April 15th will probably be the deadline for this. Also, speaking of just like cool things, I want to thank Saints Unscripted for this cool T-shirt they gave me. Probably next week sometime we'll be releasing. I'll be on there. The interview will be released. So shout out to my homies at Saints Unscripted, the leading LDS youth YouTube channel. Okay, now that we got that all the way, I am so excited about this guest we have today. His name is Chris Thomas, and he wrote this book that just came out, Unexpected: The Backstory of Finding Elizabeth Smart and Growing Up in the Culture of an American Religion. And there's a picture of you, and there's Elizabeth. And of course, Elizabeth wrote the foreword. By the way, if you're looking for a funny anecdote about an incident that happened in Hawaii that he found out for the first time when she submitted the foreword, it's worth the price of admission just for that alone. Chris Thomas, who was a very vital, important person who did public relations for the family. He was essentially one of the people who coordinated all the media and the journalism and was often a spokesperson for the family during the Elizabeth Smart kidnapping saga. Chris Thomas, welcome to the program.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me.
And so one of the reasons I also wanted to have Rebecca come on is because you were actually, you of course lived in Utah. You were this group of moms who, stay-at-home moms, who essentially all they did was talk and speculate about this. So that's going to inform the conversation as well. And I think it might be good for Rebecca to even chime in at times about maybe what she was experiencing during those times as well, because it was in the book. Okay, let me just talk a little bit about this book. You couldn't have written this book 6 months after the events happened. And it wouldn't have been appropriate because it's really an autobiography about you. But plenty of things have now been written about Elizabeth, so we know that story, and she's had her voice. She's told her story. But the reason why this book couldn't have been written until now is because this is a story of a person who's telling almost an autobiographical thing, where given time, where he's able to look back in his past, he's able to actually make connections of all these different things that happened in his life, becoming of age, becoming a child, going on a mission, growing up. And then now he realizes that it was almost like it was a lifetime of preparation for what you were about to go through, the gauntlet you were going to go through. All right. And I one of the things I really love about this book is that it's you are a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and you tell the story of Mormonism, but not a story of this, like the story that people like to tell, this big corporation and this long history, kind of like under the banner of heaven, and try to tie the story in. You tell the Mormonism from the ward and neighborhood level. And I really, really love that, because it really humanized people. So I think why I'm kind of just really gushing on this book is I just finished it today, and it's still just, I'm still reeling from it. This is an excellent book. I did cry. I actually cried. All right. Wow. That's how good of a book this is, Chris. So Chris, I'm sorry. I just want to say thank you very much for writing this book. This is an excellent book. I heartily endorse this book. For those of you who are interested in the Elizabeth Smart trial and want to hear this inside story of so many things that happened, blew my mind. But I think before we get started on talking about Elizabeth Smart and the kid, it's really about the saga of the kidnapping and your relationship with the family and the media and all that. I want you to talk a little bit about your past, because the key thing is that this story starts with a childhood story. And every chapter essentially is your childhood story, and then tacked on to that is the story of what happened later in your life. Talk a little bit, one, why you decided to make that approach, and then talk a little bit about your past as well.
Well, Steve, it's interesting what you bring up with this as it being this, looking back. And I think it's a universal experience. I think if you went in your life and really looked back on certain experiences, you would realize that there'd been adversity, there'd been people that had prepared you for that. I don't know that that was necessarily unique, but you're right. 20 years later, having that lens was very different. Maybe giving kind of the origin of the book might help in giving that background, but I spoke at the Salt Lake Rotary Club. I was kind of the warm-up act to the main speaker in November of 2019. And right before this, like a couple of hours before I was speaking, I got a call and they said, "Hey, it's Veterans Day. We have a lot of veterans. You're going to need to change your speech." And the thing that was most common to me was growing up next door to this individual who was a hidden broken war hero with a secret. And so I told his story, and I thought it went pretty well. And then after the main speaker, I was deluged with people. Everybody had an uncle or a grandfather or somebody that had suffered something similarly. And they said, "You really should write this book." COVID hit a little while later. And so I wrote this book of coming of age and learning to understand and respect this man before it was too late. And then I wrote an epilogue that all of a sudden I was finding like there were a lot of things that I learned through that experience that really prepared me for the SMART case. And my wife read it and she said, "That's your book. It's how these two tie together." And I told her, "Honey, that's never going to work. You're crazy." And she said, "No, there's a way to do it." And she was even pulling more parallels out between the two. And so she really pushed me, and I started working with a woman that consulted on it, who's a former New York Times reporter and had written a number of successful books. And she helped me structure it, and I found a way to do it. And I think it turned out pretty well, but it does. It goes back and forth. I grew up in Salt Lake, in the suburb of East Mill Creek, in working middle class neighborhood, and during the 80s, and it kind of waxes a little bit nostalgic as we go through that, but how the church was very different then, and when I talk about the church, it's more the culture, I think, and really I like how you said I look at it from really that grassroots level. So coming of age with that and how that prepared me, and then really some of those lessons, a lot of the lessons I learned from the most unlikely hero in my life, this man Baker Paxton, who was the alcoholic who lived next door. There were so many things that prepared me that I didn't see in that moment. So there's maybe, I don't know, does that give you the back?
That's what's so interesting about this story is you kind of open up with this story with him and you in a confrontation as a teenager, I believe is when it's opening scene, as I recall. I'm still digesting the book, but it's early on in the book. And then you revisit that incident later on in the book as well, as I recall. But I'm like, where's this guy going? Because at first I'm thinking, why is he telling this story? I'm expecting to hear about Elizabeth Smart. But once I picked this thing up, and honestly, I was talking to Rebecca. We were trading messages, and we had kind of said, well, Rebecca, maybe if we don't have time, maybe you can cover these chapters and I can cover this chapters, and between the two of us, we can get this book right. By golly, I'm reading this book and I couldn't put the thing down. And it because once I kind of got the cadence of the story and how you're telling it, then I was reading two separate stories, but both were so compelling and interesting in their own way. And so I just thought the way you told the story was just fascinating and ingenious. And yeah, that story with Baker, man, that just, man, that one really hits you hard. And it's really that just to read the Baker story in and of itself is a compelling story. And so I think that it's really interesting that this whole thing got its start telling about his story. And really it's fascinating because you would also talk about there are other Bakers. There's a ton of them, like you said, all their uncles that came out. And you got to maybe even you talk about later on in the book about experiencing somebody who also was another Baker, and tied it in with the Elizabeth Smart thing. I mean, man,
No spoilers there, but I mean,
but I think it's
that was such a remarkable experience that tied the two together, and that was part of that epilogue. I don't want to spoil it for those who haven't read. That was a remarkable experience that I was in awe. That I already was on this cloud, having not slept for a couple of days, and Elizabeth was home, and it was a miracle, and then this other miracle occurs. It just really brought it all together in such a remarkable way. I could not believe that happened. But it was as though, I'd been prepared. I'd been prepared for that case and prepared for that moment, very much through Baker.
So a couple of things I need to talk to you about. And of course, Rebecca, we're going to have you chime in here too, but you and I are the same age. And I grew up watching WGN because I grew up just outside Chicago. And Harry Carey and Steve Stone were your biggest heroes. You started with the 83 Cubs. I started with the 84 Cubs. Was my first team. The team that was a great team.
Oh, yeah.
But also broke your heart. I remember
Great.
crying. And then so you the Chicago Cubs played a role. We're the same age, so you're telling your childhood story, and it's like there's so many parallels that I have, and I'm like, oh man, this is great. So we got at least talk a little bit about the Chicago Cubs too, because they played a major role in your life, dude.
I mean, they raised me. Yeah, it's funny. I refer to, there was this summer where a number of the characters in there all go away, and I was like, my two best friends that summer were Steve Stone and Harry Carey.
That's right.
And every day you watch the Cubs. That was just my routine, and was fortunate enough as well, being an airline brat a little bit later, to get out there. My favorite thing every summer was to go and hang out at Wrigley, hang out with the bleacher bums.
That's great. I love it. What a great story. So again, this is how much detail he gives. Really intimate deals about his childhood, baseball card collecting, becoming a big Utah Jazz fan. Of course, he had to contend with the Jordan Bulls that I got to root for, and they broke your heart more. He broke your heart more a few times, and I always like to rub that into my Utah Jazz fans. But yeah, so it's just a great, interesting story, because you and I, like I said, the same age, so there's so many parallels, and that made you so relatable to me. And in just your childhood, growing up in your neighborhood you grew up in, you gave us really great, vivid stories about this trial that happened with your friend Annabelle. Was that Annabelle with the trial, and how it was kind of like your first perceived girlfriend, and all these really cool stories. So it's just, you paint a very vivid picture of your childhood. So I want you to talk a little bit more about your childhood, and then I want us to kind of segue into starting to talk about the SMART ordeal as well.
Sure. I mean, I had probably the most quirky childhood. I mean, my father was this really interesting man who was constantly chasing a buck and hustling and trying to find something. And my mom was this very grounded former school teacher, and it just anything went. And this neighborhood was just fascinating. Lived in a really small ward that actually struggled. It was almost more like an out-of-state ward, which it's strange that you would have that inside of Utah. And there were a lot of characters inside of that. But the neighbors were very tight, which isn't uncommon. I think that's still indicative today, but it was just such a different time. And it was fun to go back and relive that and think about what it was like growing up during the 80s. And from a pop culture standpoint, but as well as from a church culture standpoint.
So I have to have Rebecca chime in, because one of our craziest interviews I ever did was when Rebecca told many stories about growing up in a Mormon household in the 70s and 80s. I imagine for you, Rebecca, that there was a lot of stuff that resonated with you when he was talking about this stuff.
Well, that's what I think is funny, is that you're saying, oh, Chris, you're like my best friend. You told my childhood. And I'm saying, no, Chris, you're my best friend. You told my childhood. So that is how accessible this book is, as far as just everything that's shared and the nuances. And absolutely, we were talking before we started recording that this captured, I'm a little older than both Steve and Chris, but it captured just that era, that heyday, growing up LDS. You still had road shows, you still had church ball, you had everybody gathering in backyards for service projects and potlucks, and everyone knew each other. Everybody had each other's phone number. I mean, it was just, it was just a way to grow up, and you really capture that. And what I really appreciated about the book is that, as we'll get into later, all the experiences with Elizabeth, though that part of the book was tense. I mean, I listened to it on audiobook, and it was tense. You really portrayed just kind of the feelings that you had, just the intensity and the non-sleep. And as soon as you'd almost had it with that part of the book, it would go into this childhood. And you're like, okay, now I'm in a safe space. I can enjoy this childhood part, and then we'll get back to this. So I absolutely loved that. And one of my favorite characters in the book, not characters, but real people, I think, was your mother. She just seemed amazing. Both your parents did. It seemed like this perfect yin and yang of a creative kind of wacky genius in your dad, and then just this really grounded, the advice, the way that she spoke to you. I have all sons, so I was reading it going, dang, I wish I would have thought to say something like that to my boys. Your mom seemed awesome. Maybe talk just a little bit about your parents and that influence, because it really came across in the story. It really did.
Right. Well, I think it was interesting because my mother was somewhat of a convert to the church, and my grandparents both were different religions and decided we'll just let the kids fall where they may. And my mother's best friend took her to church. And so when she was 10 or 11, she was baptized, but came from a very different household. And she really made a concerted effort growing up. I think the statement is to be of the world, but what is the statement? And it's in the
world,
chapter.
but not of the world.
In, but not of, or the other way around.
She always pushed me to be different, because that's one of the things in Utah. There's just sometimes there's not a lot of individuality. Everyone's trying to be the same, and so cut against the grain. But she pushed that and was one of my biggest cheerleaders. Taught me how to write. Was somebody though. There's that chapter where I'm going to leave the church. I've been offended, and she doesn't say, no, you're not. She says, well, okay, you're old enough to make that decision, but let's make sure it's not an emotional decision. I want you to think through it. And if that's what you decide, I'm on board. And that's how she parented. And it was quite remarkable because it really gave me the opportunity to learn and grow and make my own mistakes versus someone telling me what to do all the time.
And just your dad was quite the character, and he got you going with the creepy crawler. What's that? The crawler's business.
Night crawlers.
Night crawlers, and with the bait, and it's just, folks. It's like it's two books, right? It's two stories being told. It's worth it for both stories. So really, honestly, it's two for the price of one. It's that good, and that's the thing is that and actually it resonated with me too, because one of the things as I've been going on my journey with my channel is I have I've gone on podcasts and talked about how I had never was intended on starting this podcast. And here I've been obsessed with Mormonism since I was a young child. And there would be times you're like, why am I doing this? And then next thing you know, it all falls into place once the channel starts. And then it's like, now I have a chance to look back and like, oh, now I see. Now I get why that happened. Now I understand why I had to go through that trial. Now I get it. And I feel like you had kind of that same moment with this, is that you was like, oh my goodness, I was just being prepared for this all along for that moment. And I think I don't know. I mean, I can read this and say, this kind of looks like the divine hand was on your life. And this story was preparatory for you. Would you say that God played a role, your faith played a role in this as well?
Absolutely. I think so often, though, we don't see that. We don't see it when we're going through adversity. But sometimes even after the fact, you said it very well, Steve. 6 months after the Smart case, I would have never written this book. It really did take 20 years to realize, like, oh, wait, this happened. I don't think it was happenstance. I wrote Baker's story first. And I thought, his story, in fact, when I was arguing with my wife over doing the braided memoir, I said, but I really want Baker's story to stand alone. I don't want it to get lost in the Smart case. And she said, if you're never going to get it published as a standalone, and people, by putting them together, people are going to learn. And I've heard that feedback. It's only been out a week, but I've heard that feedback repeatedly from people that were like, the unexpected part was Baker, and that story was so rich and so meaningful. So I feel like having the opportunity to tell his story for me was a little bit of redemption. Here was this man that we had the most acrimonious relationship imaginable until the very end. And I think about him all the time. I have for years, maybe daily. And being able to share, he made this tremendous sacrifice to our country. We think of those, and I don't want to make light of it, but those who die in combat as paying the ultimate price. And I realized through my experiences with him that there are those among the living who've paid an even greater price. And wanting to honor that, wanting to honor this very difficult life and this price he paid. And so I really wanted to bring him out. And so that was a big piece of it for me.
Yeah. Wow. And then, that's the thing is, as I'm reading the book, and you have the opening scene where you got Mayor Rocky and this whole thing happening with the police department. And I'm just like, I want to slap some people in the face the way they were treating Ed and way they were treating Elizabeth. You open it just kind of abruptly like that, and I'm just like, I can't believe this. I thought Mayor Rocky was a cool guy, but man, there was just so much stuff going on with the police department and everything. And you open up with the story with that. I mean, dude, what was that like having to handle all that kind of stuff? Because had no idea there was all this behind the scenes stuff going on, how crazy it was. And how so often people would lose sight of the fact that we're looking for Elizabeth. That was the thing. You get so caught up in the machinations and the politics in this story. That's what makes it so astonishing to me.
Wow, you know, I start the book on that day she was found, which was one of the most remarkable days of my life. And there were experiences, and I try really hard to be as delicate as possible. I think Mayor Rocky's a great guy.
Okay.
I have no issues with Mayor Rocky. I want to be really clear.
Okay.
I always had huge respect for him. At the same time, there were elements in this story, and there are people that didn't like some of the things I've shared in there. But I had to do that. I had to be true. I really have tried to approach this as a journalist and to be as true to the facts as I possibly could while, you know, thinking about and looking at and trying to understand. But that was a difficult experience, seeing this girl that had been in captivity a couple of hours earlier, you know, the glad handing that was taking place, the people introducing themselves. It was, you know, for me, and that was part, and maybe that was part of the reason that meeting her then became so meaningful, because at the police station, I went out of my way not to introduce myself. I did like the opposite. Like, she doesn't need one more person putting a hand out and telling her that they prayed for her. And so it wasn't until that night, and I'm sure there were so many things going on. I don't even think she realized I was at the police station that night. When she saw me at the house, she was taken aback because she's like, who is this? And that was just a remarkable thing, meeting her for the first time, and you know, Ed's kind words about, you know, considering me like a brother, and that she should too. It was an incredible experience.
Yeah, it really was. And
How old were you when this was happening? I was trying to calculate that in the book.
So I was 29 when she was abducted.
That's what I thought. So
And so
young.
really young, and you know, and this was
Yeah.
way over my head. I often compare it, maybe getting a little faithful here, but it was like serving a second mission. You know, I served a mission in South Korea. Language was really hard. Culture was very different. It was over my head probably the entire 2 years. Like I found myself just constantly trying to figure it out, constantly saying silent prayers, help me to know what to do. And that was the smart case. I mean, things were happening so quickly. The pressure was immense, knowing that even one misstep could be the difference of finding her or not finding her. And, you know, I really felt like I was led quite a bit. And I, you know, it was a very prayerful thing. And knowing too, that there were people all around the world praying for her and praying for those who were trying to find her. I felt that.
And you were so involved in this, just being a stay-at-home mom with all the other moms. You had your little group, and you guys had your little theories you were talking about. Maybe just talk a little bit about living in that Utah at that time as a mom, and what was that like for you?
Yeah, it was actually a really fascinating time for me. I was trying to figure out, I think I was 37-ish, but had just moved to this new neighborhood, as most of us had. So this whole crisis, going through it together, actually bonded the neighborhood gals that were at home together. It was something that you could talk about right away, because everybody was keeping up on every detail. We had a little walking group, running group, and just went through, you know, first of all, devastated, because it could have happened to any of our own, you know, any of them. We had children the age of, you know, some Elizabeth and some younger. I remember that we all talked about having talks with our kids to say, if anyone comes into your room in the middle of the night, don't go to the second location. I mean, we addressed this with our children. We learned it. We used it as a time to tell them, you know, don't be silent, start screaming. You know, hindsight, of course, is 2020, right? And no one can be in that room when that happened. But, you know, we were concerned, we were worried, we were talking about it, we were watching the news nonstop. I remember feeling like some of the things we'd see on the news were conflicting a little bit. You know, we'd see one story, then we'd see something else that brought something else up. Then we saw some things maybe about the Smart family themselves. They started going down that path, which you explained very well in your book, because we were all confused. Well, why are they saying these things about the family? What is it? We had all kinds of theories. We right away thought, because it's Utah, that it might have something to do with the polygamist sect. We absolutely thought that. I remember hearing something about how the Smarts had gone to a family reunion, extended family. We thought, could there be someone, you know, in that reunion that had seen her, you know, got his sights on her. But as I mentioned before to Chris and Steve, our main concern in this group, we were so frustrated that on every billboard and everything we heard, they kept saying, look for this little girl, look for this child. And when you read her vital statistics, she was taller than I was. So I felt like, although she's a child, you need to tell everybody to be on the lookout for someone that is not a little girl. Look up, don't down, not down. That's what we all kept saying. So I don't know. We were just very involved, very concerned, praying, wondering, thinking. I mean, it consumed us for that whole, summer and fall until she was found. So yeah, quite. I didn't have a question. I just kind of had a statement, right? No, I want to ask about that. Did you guys ever think about mentioning her height and or anything like that?
Yeah, we did initially. My understanding, and I came into working with them about day 2 or day 3, so I wasn't there right off. But they just found what they had and put it out. And so 2-3 weeks in, I was actually saying the same thing. Like, I don't think this is the right description. And they gave me a whole bunch of home videos and gave me a whole bunch of pictures and said, all right, make some B-roll and work to get some more updated B-roll out where she was a little bit older, B-roll being the background footage that's used on television. And so we did get some older images, but the image that still exists is the one of her on the beach and her brother with the hot dog stick, and it's very ominous. Is it ominous? I can't come out with the right words today. But yeah, that's the one we remember. But yeah, that was a concern of mine as well. And it wasn't anything that had been intentionally done. It just was, circumstantial. Let's get out what we've got. And
well, she is a child. That's the whole point. She was a child. But sometimes, when you're actually just physically looking for someone standing in a crowd, you more need the physical description than you do the age, because, and as we know, that's kind of what it was. People did spot them, thought it was an older person with them, or I think at one point didn't even say this is my other way. Anyway, yeah. So, but it was, I don't know, Steve, it was just, everybody was talking about it. Everybody was thinking about it. Everybody was watching the news here in Utah and worldwide. And it was just, everybody wanted to do something. I did have friends that said, I'm going to go up to the command center and see if I can search or help one day. I had littler kids, so I wasn't able to do that. But, and then when she was found, we all felt like the other people that approached you, we felt like we were part of it. We felt like our prayers had, our thoughts had sort of made it happen. You were just so involved emotionally all those months. So it was
such a collective experience.
Yeah,
Rebecca. I mean, and not just here in Utah. I've talked to many people that have no connections to the Latter-day Saint Church that had that same collective experience in parts all around the country, even in different parts of the world. It was amazing how that brought us together in a unique way.
Oh yeah, and of course, it was interesting just in itself, but then they had the Mormon part, which I was interested in Mormonism. It added another level of interest for me too, as well. But I am curious, just real quick, how did you get involved in doing this in the first place? How did they reach out to you? What made somebody decide that this 29-year-old guy is going to take the job that you took?
Yeah, so Elizabeth's cousin Sierra, who was a senior at the University of Utah, started an internship with my firm 2 weeks before Elizabeth was abducted. And her father, Tom Smart, who's a photojournalist at the Deseret News, was good friends with my business partner's dad. And so there were a lot of different connections. It really felt, Missy Larson, my other business partner, grew up in the Smarts ward, and her parents still lived there. I mean, we had all these connections. It was like we had been destined to do it. And I get a lot of credit, but there was a team that worked on this. Initially, we had about 8 people working full time. Our agency, we put all of our clients on hold for the first couple of weeks, and we're working on it. We thought it was going to be a couple of days and we'd get back to our day jobs, and everyone else went back to the agency, and I stayed with the family for the next 9.5 months. But we volunteered initially. It really was kind of a labor of love for us over that period. Never got involved to make a name for ourselves. Heaven forbid, had no idea 20 years later we'd be talking about it.
Yeah. And then, of course, I think one of the things too is, like, we talk about the role that Mormonism, of course, played in this, and that's a fascinating thing, because I think one of the things that you do is you try to push back on a narrative. One of the narratives that developed was a criticism of the church, that she was primed for polygamy and primed for a prophet that would tell her things to do, and she was kind of semi-brainwashed before she was even kidnapped. That was kind of one of the narratives that came out of this whole story too. And you push back on that narrative.
Yeah, I do a little bit. I mean, at the time when Elizabeth was rescued, our focus was the fact that she survived it, that she was smart enough to really outwit. We didn't find this out till years later, but she outwitted her captor. It's a fascinating story. You know, she convinced him to come back to Utah because of all the young women's camps, and that Elizabeth could help him, you know, identify and get another wife from that. And that was enough to get him back. And she was rescued, which is, I told Elizabeth this so many times, like, that was so genius. And she's like, you know, like, no big deal. But you know, she really figured that out. But at that time, it didn't make sense to address those things from her perspective and her family's perspective. Our focus was on the fact that she had survived, that she was well, that she wanted to be home. And in the book, though, I do go a little deeper on it. At the time, I thought a lot about it. I thought about wanting to address some of those things, but it just wasn't in the family's best interest.
Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to ask you too, because of course you have, and I want to go back to some more of this, but it just off the top of my head, you know, we had this conversation before about how you still do work with Elizabeth. And the question I had for you last time, I'm going to ask it to you this time, is how is Elizabeth Smart doing right now?
She's doing really well. I mean, she's become like a sister, a younger sister to me. And we talk probably once a week, maybe more often than that. And I'm always inspired by her, just by who she is. And, you know, anybody who's had any type of life, but then gives back in the way she gives back and sees the world the way she sees it. At the same time, she's just like you and me. She has frustrating days with kids and carpools and, you know, all kinds of things that can go home. She's a homebody. She loves to be at home. She's I think naturally kind of shy, which surprises a lot of people. But really is most happy when she's with her kids and alone. But you know, is as good-hearted and as kind as you would expect. And it's just surprising how well she is doing.
And another woman that I think that I want to ask about too is your wife. You know, in the book, you talk about her, and it was taxing on your marriage. It was eating into your weekends. I mean, you were obsessed with it. And there were some periods of time you talk about, there was some stressful stuff going on between you two. But it sounds to me like she really was a great companion to you, a great wife to have as somebody to help you, because I mean, she had to take on a burden on this too.
Oh, no question about that. She really was. We were newlyweds. So our anniversary was the day before Elizabeth was abducted, our first anniversary. So we were trying to get used to, you know, figuring each other out. We were still in that early phase, and it was difficult. And there's no question that challenged us in a lot of different ways. She was a huge collaborator on the book with me. Her name probably should be there right next to mine. I mean, just was there every step of the way. And we relived some of the trauma. I mean, we had to go back to counseling to kind of work through some of it again. But in the end, really realized that it made us much stronger as a couple. But she is remarkable. I could not be more fortunate to have her as my companion and partner.
That's wonderful. Do you still have relationships or friendships with all the different newscasters, I mean, you were playing in that space with I mean, yeah, that's what I mean. I listened on audio, and so I listened to all the end of the book where they go through all the people that you'd like to thank. And I mean, it was like 19 minutes. I just thought, are you still in contact with all these people that were there? They were pivotal. You had these relationships.
Yeah. With a lot of them, and you know, became very dear friends. It was interesting. We had a symbiotic relationship, and in the same vein, we went through this experience together that was so not just miraculous, but refining. I mean, you talk to most of the reporters I worked with, and they'll tell you the highlight of their career was covering Elizabeth Smart, even some of the national ones that did that. But I've been really fortunate to have great relationships with them. And it's kind of strange because you're always supposed to keep this symbiotic relationship. So hopefully I don't get her in trouble, but Debbie Dujanovic, and there's several, I don't want to leave anybody else, but I went and did her show on KSL last week. And after she gave me a 6-pack of Diet Coke, and you'll know what that, you know, there's a couple of Diet Coke references, which I just thought I was just so touched, so creative and so thoughtful. And, you know, that kind of demonstrates what some of those relationships are still like.
Yeah, I
the
imagine
old-
that you could not go through something like that without maintaining contact, and in some cases, a friendship that goes without saying,
I
you've
mean,
just gone through it.
he's shooting hoops with Sean Hannity in the ward at the gym, right? I mean, that was a unique story. It's all that has sudden you're passing the ball to Sean Hannity. He's making some jump shots.
And giving a little bit more detail on that for those who are hearing this for the first time. A few weeks in, I would blow off steam, and usually for just a couple of minutes, by shooting hoops in the gym. I'm a basketball junkie. And so that outside of prayer, that was kind of my refuge. And this one day I'm shooting, and from nowhere, I hear this voice. I'm like, I know that voice. And Sean Hannity had got past security and was in the gym, and he wanted to play basketball. So we played basketball for a little bit. It was interesting writing that because he's such a polarizing figure. And I didn't want to make it about him being polarizing. So I had to really write it in a way that those who don't like Sean Hannity would see the humanity of it, and those who like Sean Hannity would see the humanity of it. But that was just how crazy of an experience is that somebody like that all of a sudden shows up in the gym and wants to shoot hoops.
It is. It's crazy. And then I wanted to know, just like the Smarts now, Ed Smart, of course, since all this happened, he's come out as gay. And then, I'm sorry, the mother's name is she passed away, and
Lois is
no, I'm sorry, I
no.
was misreading something. Lois and Ed, how are they doing?
I think Ed is happy. I spoke to Ed a couple of weeks ago. He had just finished the book and was very complimentary. Actually, not a lot. I heard at one point that he was concerned about the book, and it kind of kept me up because he's such a dear friend. I think you see that as you read it. I mean, we were really, really close, and so that was nice. And it seems like he's very happy where he is. Lois, I haven't talked to in a couple of years, but I know some people that live over in her neighborhood said she's doing well. Elizabeth updates me from time to time. It's been difficult. I think anytime a family goes through a divorce, mine did during the Smart case, it's a challenge. And it creates some new dynamics, and it's something that it takes a while to really figure out. And I know it's been hard on her, and I feel for her. I think that's a really tough position to be in.
Certainly. And I also just let me see. There was one more thing I wanted to ask you about. While I'm thinking about Rebecca, grab this.
You think, I'll talk. There you go. I was curious, and I guess maybe we should point out, when you talk about the gym, the local meeting house became the command center for the entire time. So I would love to hear just more about the church support there. I mean, they must have just mobilized everything for that entire time period, and gave the building to you guys to use for that. Maybe talk about that incredible support system that just sprung up immediately.
I always say membership, and that doesn't mean you have to be. I think it's important because I know there's some post-Mormons that are big followers of yours. I like to think, in the wards that I've been involved with, that we're all collectively part of this family, whether we're members or not members, or active or inactive. We're all part of this family, and membership has its privileges. You can go anywhere in the world and find an LDS congregation that will help you if you're in need. And the way in which the ward and stake family responded was miraculous. I mean, it's how it's supposed to be. It was organized and really figuring out how best to serve and help this family, and people rose to the occasion. And it was, I write, one of my favorite parts in the book is talking about the Search Center. And seeing, the people coming that first week, 10,000 people came out to search, and seeing the barriers come down. We get so caught up on stupid stuff. We really do. Whether it's whatever our differences might be, political, religious, whatever else, and just seeing everybody setting it aside for a minute and focusing on helping and serving. And to me, that was just so touching. Every time I saw it, I felt like I would get emotional walking past the cultural hall where they did the orientations. But yeah, a church is an interesting place to set up an operation, and it worked, and people were very patient through the process because it was disruptive for a lot of people.
This is what I want to talk about. Was what I forgot about was the timeline, how this isn't that long after September 11th, and not that long after the Winter Olympics. So these two big major events, both international events, one of them taking place in your backyard. And then you have the it's like, it's amazing that it didn't get lost. That I thought about, because this was such a big cultural phenom. It almost seemed like something that would have been a big deal before September 11th, but wouldn't have been after, because our world changed. But it surprised me how much we returned back to normalcy, focusing on Elizabeth Smart months after September 11th. I guess I had a different memory of that period of time, if that makes sense to you.
Well, I think by summer, things had started to mellow a little bit. And summer is such a slow time. I mean, I think Congress is out. The media gets a little bit bored. There's this kind of story du jour. I never really followed that until post-Smart case. And every year in the summer, it's kind of fun to see where the stories come from. But prior to the Smart case, all the media had been in California because there had been shark attacks, and so this was more compelling than shark attacks, which it was. But yeah, it's interesting that it became such a key piece of our national consciousness after those huge events.
Exactly. Yeah. It's up there with them. That's what makes it so amazing, is I didn't realize it happened after those two major events. And then just to think of how Utah history, how pivotal that year would have been in just the history of that state, and how much the culture would have been changed via the Winter Olympics as well as that. I mean, it was probably a pretty remarkable time to be in Utah as well, for just in general.
Yeah, no question. I mean, they talk about the Mormon moment.
Yeah.
I think that was a little bit later, or around that time. I guess the Olympics were part of that. But yeah, and I don't know that Elizabeth is always seen as part of that, but definitely was.
And it also reminds me too, is I totally forgot, as I was going through my memory banks of this period of time, I'd also reminded of the fact, and you may have touched on it in the book, I don't remember, but the church made a concerted effort even back then to be called the Church of Jesus Christ to the international media. I kind of forgot about that.
Yeah.
That was back in my memory banks.
Yeah, in writing it,
and you talk about the name in the book.
Well, like the first edit. I mean, I grew up in the Mormon church and in the Mormon culture, and I really respect the prophet, and I try to abide by that as much as possible. The first edit, it was like, oh shoot, I got a lot of changes to make. But in some cases, it just didn't make sense, and I don't know. Sometimes the context is such, or having a conversation with somebody outside of the faith and you keep correcting it, it's just counterproductive. I think we have to have common sense and how we try to abide by that, but in the same vein, how we apply it.
That's a good point. I was going to ask you, so now I remember reading or hearing something on the news that the Olympics were actually really tied into the reason that he was even working at the Smart home, because I remember hearing that there was a concerted effort in downtown Salt Lake to clean up sort of the look, and that they had taken people that were perhaps homeless or didn't have anywhere to go, and they'd like offered shaves and haircuts. Do you remember this at all? You don't remember this?
I'm not familiar. No.
Yeah, and so the thing was that when Lois, was it Lois or Ed that had hired, saw a clean cut, nice looking man who looked trustworthy and invited him over to the house. Had she seen him a week earlier, where he was looking like he looked when we saw him, she probably never would have made that offer. And so I thought that was interesting, because definitely during the Olympics, they wanted to put the best foot forward. There was a lot of, all kinds of changes to make sure everything looked good on the world stage. And I just remember hearing that was part of that. That was one of the reasons that, he seemed like he would be okay to come over and do some work, because he looked trustworthy. So I don't know. I've always thought that was an interesting.
A little before that, I worked downtown. I mean, he'd been a fixture downtown. I'd seen him numerous times. I worked not too far from where the ZCMI mall was, and I often cross over to the Crossroads Mall, and he was always there. My understanding is post 9/11, it became very hard to panhandle or to get jobs or anything else if you looked like you were Middle Eastern, for better or for worse. That was the circumstances. So if that was the case, it wasn't a hard sell to clean up.
Right.
You're right. If he had looked like he did when I worked downtown, it's probably less likely that they would have hired him.
Yeah.
One of the things I also wanted to talk about with this book too was that this is for a general audience. And that's why it says Culture of an American Religion, because you don't want to make this into just an LDS book. So one of the things I really enjoy about this book is that you actually take the time to explain the church, its history, what the priesthood is. You kind of give there's a lot of good information. So if there's actually people who are wanting to learn about the history of the church, and it's a very accessible, this is also a good book for you too. I would recommend for that, because you actually do give a nice little summation of your church and its history and the church that you grew up in.
Absolutely. And I hoped in writing it that I would be able to write something that would be informative to those not of the faith and affirming to those that are. I was really fortunate. So I found this group of writers from around the country. None of them had any connection to the Latter-day Saint Church. And I don't know if they knew anyone. They had no connections to Utah. And in an early reading, we'd share 800 words every month. So it was just a snippet. And in one of the early readings, they're like, wait a second, tell me, you're not sharing your story. You need to get deeper into your culture. And these people are very cynical too. I mean, very kind of in your face. And they really pushed me. They really pushed me you need to go deeper here. You need to say more there. And we're a terrific sounding board as well. So does that make sense? Does it not make sense? Because I wanted this to appeal to an audience outside, and really had hoped that it might educate, maybe even change some perceptions, because I think some of the stereotypes, in fact, Marion Roach Smith, who helped me with this and later did an edit on the book, she came back and said that she was embarrassed with what she had thought and perceived before, that not that she still didn't have her qualms with the religion, but how far off she was. And that she said more people like me need to read your book. So my hope is that it does educate, and it's not meant to be necessarily a spiritual book. There are some spiritual parts in it, but I really wanted it to be informative. And I think I've heard from people inside the culture who've said, that was interesting. I didn't know that. I didn't know the history of this. So it was an interesting exercise, something I hadn't planned on doing at all. But I'm really glad that it turned out that way.
Yeah, I think it's very, very, very helpful to the reader, especially for those of you who aren't really familiar with the church. And I think it was important to give that perspective in there as well. Well, Rebecca,
Yeah, and it was kind of seamlessly integrated, I felt.
Exactly.
It wasn't like you're saying, and now in this paragraph, I will
gotta
explain
lecture
Mormonism.
you.
It
Yeah.
wasn't that way at all. You
Right.
just sort of came away from the chapter going, oh, I learned something. I didn't know that about that religion. That's very interesting, or how beautiful that is, or something. And I also, you talked about and brought up, because it has to do with this case, some of the darker parts, perhaps, of which is sort of attributed to Mormonism sometimes. You brought up the Laffertys. You brought up some of that. Maybe talk a little bit about that, because, of course, that became part of the case. People said, oh, polygamy, oh, this darker past, it's all there. So you brought that up, I thought, in a very fair way. You addressed it. I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit.
I think there's a lot of dialogue on that. I mean, Under the Banner of Heaven, you did that series, which was really interesting to hear those perspectives and to hear the people. I'd read stories, that were very critical of that, but hearing the people that were involved and their experience was fascinating. And so I wanted to be informative. I wanted to approach that. I think people outside of Utah, I do a fair amount of work outside of the state, and I have a number of friends who have very little connection, and so their perceptions are often incorrect. Early on, I share an experience when I was younger and was on a trip to Missouri, and the cashier asked me how many wives my father had, and I was like so offended by it. But it made me stop and think. I'd never seen a polygamist growing up. I have since, but at that time had never seen one. And I think people have this total misperception. And then when we look at those who, the Brian David Mitchells and the LeBarons and a number of those people, they're radicals within radicals. A really cool experience I had a number of years ago. A guy did some work on our house, found out he was a polygamist. Talked to him about doing some more work, and he invited us over to his house. And we went to this place. It was kind of weird to get to out in the southwest part of the valley, and spent some time with his family and some of the people out there. And it was fascinating to see, these were good people, faithful people, God-fearing people that, if we're stereotyped, where are they? But, generally when we get down to things, it's a small radical group that creates a bad name for everyone. Not making a statement there necessarily about polygamists, but it changed my perception, spending some time and getting to understand and see just how wonderful these people were. And I kind of hope to do the same thing with the book, is to address that gosh, there's a few radicals out there that they say they do this in the name of religion. I mean, Elizabeth in her book made it clear that Brian David Mitchell, while he used it as leverage, all he cared about was sex and alcohol. This was not religious. This was not something he was doing as some part of his practicing this religion. He did it because, I think the word I used is self-centered radicalism. Which, and I'm sure there's some argument on that. I put that out there, but really believe that, we're seen as though there's a whole bunch of Brian David Mitchells and Warren Jeffs out there, when, there's a few people, unfortunately, that are in that position or that take advantage of this idea of religion to get what they want. And then it's, stereotyped, and it sells well. It makes for a sexy story. And not that there aren't issues, don't get me wrong on that, but it's just such a small percentage of those who give that name.
That's true. Yeah, I think that's important that is put out there. And I tell people, one of the biggest surprises that I've had starting my channel was starting to make polygamist friends, fundamentalist friends. I've had some come to my house and visit me and my family and my Christian community. That's how close I've gotten to them. So I realized too, that's actually when it's been a very humanizing thing for me too, is engaging fundamentalists and becoming friends with them. And that's really what this is all about. What I like about this book is this is really an unexpectedly great book that helps build bridges and builds a bridge from your past to your future, to your present, to your future, or to your past. Yeah. And also builds bridges of understanding in a way that you explain Mormonism to an outside audience that may not be familiar with it. And then just tells us this remarkable story. I mean, folks, we just scratched the surface of this book. The names that are in here, the twists, the turns, the things you may have remember or never heard before, it's going to be in this book. It's covered very well. So I want to thank you, Chris, so much for taking your time and coming onto the show to talk about this book.
Oh, thank you. Your perceptions of it are very meaningful to hear your feedback and to, recognize that, the things that resonated with me is, resonated with you, and I hope they will with others. I really do hope, maybe as a takeaway here, that people will take away. I mean, you had this experience with fundamentalists. We are all children of God. And the vast majority of us are good people that are much more alike than we are different. I think we struggle in the culture to get outside of ourselves, especially here in Utah, we do. And to get to know and recognize that, I often say different, that's different and different is good, and understanding and respecting that different. And so my hope is that we might be a little less judgmental and much quicker to serve.
Sounds great. Rebecca, what'd you think? Pretty good episode today, huh? We keep on cranking these out. Just wonderful people we have, and what a fantastic book we both got the privilege to read in the last couple of days.
And that's what I have to say. The biggest endorsement is that, yes, Chris, overnighted the book to us, and we thought, oh, we're doing the interview in just a day or two. We won't have time to read it. We were going to divide up the chapters. But independently, both Steve and I were like, no, I got to keep reading. I'm not going to share the chapters. I'm going to finish the whole thing. So yeah, I cannot recommend this enough. This is an unexpected, amazing book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you again. And so folks, for those of you who are interested in purchasing the book, I'm going to have links in the description so that you can purchase the book. It is now available, just only been out for less than a week now, right? And so we're very excited about having you on to promote this book. For those of you who are following Elizabeth and all the drama, if you want an inside story that you have never heard before and get insights into Ed Smart and the family, and just it's fascinating stuff. We didn't even talk about Tom Smart, which every time he made an appearance in the book, I got really nervous. Like, what's this guy going to do next? It was just a crazy story, man. But you fleshed it all out. Even the people that are made mistakes, you were able to show how that they were good people, and that they were also partly they were being traumatized in the story as well, and some people were just dealing with it that way. I mean, we could go on for another hour about this book, but I want people to buy it. So let's get out there. Let's get the word out. Unexpected by Chris Thomas, forward by Elizabeth Smart.
On Audible too. If you're not tired of my voice, you can hear it somewhere.
Audible as well. All right. So, folks, just to remind you that for those of you who'd like to support the channel, we have links in the description. If you want to support us on PayPal, on Patreon, as well as our merch store, MormonBookReviews.com, has hot chocolate mugs, t-shirts, what have you. We got it all. And also just remember the most important thing, folks, is remember all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.